Hey everybody, welcome to my little video about Ross Edwards. So Ross Edwards is an Australian composer, and this document that I have on the screen that you can see in front of you is an investigation into his compositional style and his relationships between music and ritual. Ross Edwards, his history gives us a lot of impact about his compositional style. So this is what I want to talk about today. So the idea of ritual is suggested on a number of levels when you're looking at Edwards's music. There's an artistic intention through the use of musical quotes, symbolism, and some associations. He also has it on a spiritual level from a functional perspective, and then he has compositional devices like magical features that are constantly used and repeated and fragmented. So you do tend to find this idea of ritual in repetition with Edwards's music. He was born in December 43 and he began playing piano, but he really quickly lost interest, and it wasn't until after he heard Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that he really regained this newfound vigour for music. In 63 he came into a contact with another Australian composer called Richard Mille, and he listened to a work called Las Alboradas, and he believed this to be like a sound that haunted him, that he particularly liked. He then started studying with Mille because he became his first composition teacher. And of course, a lot of the earlier influences were Stockhausen, Webern, Boulez. So in the document I've got here, this is Las Alboradas by Mille. Now, there is no actual recording. Well, there is a recording which is on vinyl. So what I've done is I've actually recreated this into a virtual music writing program. So this is a virtual recording of what's written here. Now you can hear that it's quite atonal, and of course rhythmically looking at it you can see that it is quite rhythmically complex. So this is the sort of sound that was influencing Ross Edwards at the time, from Richard Mille. And of course there was Carl Stockhausen. Now Carl Stockhausen was big into electronic music. So this is a sample from Contact, which is quite a well-known piece, and this is an electronic version. So to follow the score is a little tricky. Just follow along with the symbols that you see here. It'll make it a lot easier. I'll sort of run a guiding mouse across to help you out. Now you can hear from the recording that it's very much an interpretation of what you see in front of you, and this is what a lot of the music was like, a sort of post-1945. Another big influence, I suppose, on Ross Edwards in his youth was the serialists, Webern, Bergen and Schönberg, because Webern in particular for him. Now, for those that don't know much about serialism actually has no scale system per se, but it has what's called a 12-tone row. So in serialism, what they used to do is they'd take the 12 tones and put them in a particular order, and that order would be classified as the original row or the prime row or the P row. Now that original row could be played backwards, it could be inverted, so if it went up a minor third, they would start on the solid note, the primary note, and it would go down a minor third, and then they would play the inversion backwards, and that gave them 4 different rows, and then what they would do would be transpose them into the 12 different starting notes, which meant that they then had 48 rows that they could write a piece of music on. Now this particular piece of music I have here is Anton Webern's Variation number 1, and here on the side is a little video of the actual music that you can watch if you download the PDF from the website. You can see here on the actual music that I have taken the liberty of doing an analysis for you. So this is the original row. So it would have been an E natural, an F, followed by a C sharp, and then an E flat, a D, a C natural. Then you can see it travels down to here because that's 4, 5, 6. 7 down here, of course, is a G sharp. Then 8 is the A natural, 9 being the B flat. Over here we've got 10 being the F sharp, 11 being G, and then the 12 being the B natural. So that gives you the 12 notes of the original row. Now you can see that this is RO. Well, that's the retrograde backwards. So there's the B from here, and then we've got the F sharp and the G. There's the F sharp and the G, and you can see that it's actually playing backwards. So here it is. This is the bottom half, there's the top half, and then of course this one, there's that one, it goes across. So what he's done is he's taken the original row and the retrograde row, and he's basically motioned them in parts. When we get to here, you can see he's done the same thing with I2 and RI2. He's done the same thing here with ROPO, and then I2, RI2. So this is kind of the basis of what he starts this piece of music with. You can have a look at this work in the video, which, as I said, plays the recording for you at a later date. It's a very interesting style, serialism. Boulez was another big influence. Now I've also popped into little video links here for these two titles, being Anthemes number 2 and the Marteau sans Matre. Now with the Marteau sans Matre here, with the Boulez, this particular movement starts at about I think it starts at 7:50. I think that's where the actual the solo flute with the vocalist comes in. But it is a particular movement of that work. And then the Anthemes number 2 is for violin and for electronic recording. So all of this under here is all electronic recording. You can hear it. So the version connection I've made for you with YouTube is actually from BBC Proms, so that'll be something you can have a bit of a look at. You can see that the influences on Edwards at the time was really quite extreme. By 65, he'd achieved a degree of recognition with some of his works. So Mobile for flute, harp and viola was quite popular, and he left the ABC, because he was working at the ABC at the time, to be a copyist for Sculthorpe and Meal. And Sculthorpe, who was the next sort of influence he had, who encouraged his compositional style and became quite the heavy influence. In 66, he worked with Peter Maxwell Davies, who was also an Australian composer in residence. And up to this point, his style was very avant-garde. It was sort of the style of the 60s you've just been looking at, the serial techniques, highly structured forms, the pointillism in mannerism, so the point forms, a little bit like back here where we looked at Stockhausen, we have these points of interest. It was sort of coming along that way, pretty much. In 1970 to 1972 was his London phase. That was when he wrote the Monos 1 for cello and Monos 2 for piano solo. And particularly in the Monos 2 for piano solo, it was very dense in texture. It was very modern, and it had lots of serial techniques used in it. And in 72, he then composed the Monos 3 for solo, violin, chorus for piano and orchestra. It was at this time that depression started to set in. So he left London and he went to the Yorkshire countryside in an attempt to reconnect with a rural setting, because he wasn't in a great headspace. He was hoping for the area to inspire his compositions, and he was also very close to Anne Boyd, Martin Wesley-Smith and Alison Bald. Now, you can investigate these guys in a little bit more detail. This is a sample screen from an explanation of one of Anne Boyd's pieces, and it's sort of how sort of she looks at the cycles of life, I suppose. So that on the PDF you actually can link into that, and you can have a read through that, and it's fairly circular, and there's quite an interesting analysis. There's also, of course, on Wikipedia quite a good breakdown on Martin Wesley-Smith's material, so if you want to investigate him, you can actually have a look in more detail of his work, particularly the two themes that tend to dominate his work, which was the ideas of Lewis Carroll and then the plight of the people in East Timor. So he's a very interesting composer if you want to have a look at him in a little bit more detail. Edwards actually said in 92, looking back, I think the turning point in my early life as a composer took place in a dank Notting Hill basement toward the end of the 70s. I was a postgraduate student in London. I existed only for my work, living on bread and cheese, black coffee, chain smoking, Galoises, I think that is, writing music compulsively for 12-hour stretches and taking pills to sleep. I clearly recall the moment when I found myself questioning the validity of my course of self-destruction and at the same time that of accredited post-war music. What, ultimately, was the point of all those neurotic convulsions so meticulously ordered? Did they do anybody any good, or were they just self-indulgent? So ended my angry man phase. So you can hear from the writings of Edwards looking back, it seemed to be quite a dark time for him. In 73, we got this piece called Mountain Village and Declaring Mist, which is one that's been studied quite a lot. Although it was quite understated, it didn't really appear to have much of a direction, and it didn't really have a sense of climax or a resolution. But what it did have was a really solid Eastern influence. The title comes from a painting by a 13th century Chinese monk. He wanted to create this Zen influence of calligraphic style. He was very influenced by Toru Takemitsu at the time, and Toru Takemitsu was a Japanese composer who had some fantastic works in the steppes of Central Asia. November Steppes, November Steppes is a fantastic work if you ever want to look into it. It certainly deals with a lot of elements of the 1960s avant-garde era, usually in actual dance, which it's just a fascinating work. So if you ever get a chance to look into that work, please do. The Dorian Horizon, which was quite influential in Australia at the time, the 1970s. He had some absence of harmonic goals, but then he was looking at creating that whole Zen feel, so that's not surprising. There didn't seem to be a lack of a sense of development. He had a lot of emphasis on tone, colour and timbre. That was a big thing in this particular work. He was very much influenced by the writings of John Cage, Feldman, and of course Sculthorpe, particularly the Sun Music series, if you've ever investigated that range. Now here I've just added a couple of score samples for you. This is Takemitsu. This is segments that comes from November Steppes, which is a very interesting work. As I said, if you ever have the opportunity to study it, please do. So that's quite interesting work. This piece here is actually a segment of John Cage's prepared piano material. So this tells you where the screws are supposed to go and how far from the edge of the string and all that sort of thing, which is interesting. And of course, this was a preparation for his preludes that he did. And then this is just a sample from Peter Sculthorpe's work. So you can see how that it's actually very open and sporadic in its intent. There's lots of interjections between parts. So you can see where his influence is sort of coming. In 1974, Edwards wrote something called Antiphon, and he described it as immensely impractical. And it was for a large chorus, 48 voices or more, a brass sextet, organ, and 2 tam-tams. Now, this work was really interesting because the brass players got really upset because there was lots of long, high, sustained notes. And when they actually did it in the concert program, they had another brass piece in the program, and so that didn't help matters. So the brass players got really quite upset. The conducting of it was incredibly difficult too, because his idea was he wanted to have a flashing light to synchronise the instruments, which really wasn't practical at all. And as a compromise, the players would take it outside and their sound was amplified through speakers. That's in the original performance. He wanted chorus members to walk around with candles in a ceremonial fashion, but the fire brigade at the time banned that because it was naked flames, and they didn't think that was a very smart move. He actually now says that he jokes that it was like playing Beethoven's quartet in a phone booth, because there were just so many things that had to be compromised on what Edwards' vision was. And as a composer, you can imagine how frustrating that must have been for him. You know, why can't I have chorus members walking around with flames? Well, maybe because you might burn the place down, you know. He did have a period of silence from 1974 to 77. He says, during this time, my only serious listening was done sitting in the bush, listening more carefully to than most of us get a chance to do to the natural sounds. It helped me come to terms with the fact that all of the world's music must have originated in some way from the sounds of nature. And later, when I started writing again, it was especially the insect patterns and rhythms I heard that helped me. Now, it's interesting because around the same time, Messiaen was quite popular, who, of course, was out in the French woods notating birdsong. And he was using lots of really interesting compositional techniques like additive rhythms and bars which were timed in 3/4 but might have 3 3/4 beats in the bar. It was a very interesting sort of way of having to recreate the sounds of nature within a traditional notational form. So if you want to have a look at some very unusual notational writing, have a look at Messiaen's work. During the time he wrote something called Cantuk 1 for voice, tape, 2 pianos, harp and percussion, and then Cantuk 2 for tape, which utilised bird songs. Oops, sorry. Now, he then went into his sacred series, so that was the Shadow D Zone, which was an instrumental sectet, the Tower of Remoteness, Kamari, Etymalong, Reflections, the percussion quartet, which is quite a good work, Urago, which is percussion and orchestra, and Pond-like mantras. These are all really still, they're very quiet, they're contemplative in nature. There's a sense of timelessness with a lack of pulse. He has some very sparse textures with a focus on use of space between sounds. He liked the bell-like harmonies that you tend to find in nature, particularly with birdsong, and he had a use of near symmetries and subtle varied repetitions. He also moved to Pearl Beach in 1978, which helped to quiet his mind, I suppose. These are archetypes, so this is the sort of way that his bell-like sonorities that he heard in the nature would be recreated on an actual score. So you can see that here in the piano, he would have this extreme use of the piano registers, and then he would have use of cacciaturas tied into notes in order to give him the bell-like sound, so the crushing of the notes. But it's the extreme registers that you're looking at and the combinations here that you'll find. We were starting to see these type of archetypes in his writing. His transitional works, he saw the introduction of accompaniment figures like the minor ninth, the cacciatura. He really liked that. There was some modality starting to creep in, which doesn't surprise us because of his influence of Eastern cultures. He liked the irregular ostinato figures. The Menina series is very, very popular. It's very popular use of irregular ostinato figures in there. And he had a use of source materials like lichen, written for flute, clarinet, percussion, piano, violin, and cello. It had a transcript of a Madagascan folk song, which had very strong tonal and modal leanings and a fast tempo and rhythmic drive. So if you want to have a look at some folk relations, have a look at lichen. It's a good work. In the Menina series, now about 1980, recognising my inability to work solely on a disembodied spiritual plane, but unwilling to relax the gnomic severity of the sacred series, I responded with enthusiasm to my own impulse to leap into a new direction and compose exuberant dance music. And that's where the Menina series came. So he wrote Menina 1 for voice and cello, 2 for string quartet, 3 for wind quintet, 4 for clarinet, trombone, percussion, and 5 for voice and piano. And then he also wrote the piano concerto, marimba dances, flower songs, and the violin concerto Meninas. So anyone that's listened to the marimba dances or listened to some of Edward's dance material can see the influence of the sacred series combined with this newfound love of impulse. The Menina series employs a number of techniques used by the minimalists like Steve Reich. So he had a lot of simple modalities or motifs. He started to use prolonged drones. He had repetition of these motifs or these ideas and lots of influence of non-Western music. African mbira, the thumb piano music, for example, may have contributed to the characteristic tenseness and angularity of the melodic shapes. The heterophonic interweaving of the lines sometimes produces a gamelan-like texture. The harmony is static and drone-based, and there is much use of scales from India, Indonesia, and Japan. Again, a quote from Edwards in 1992 with regard to the Menina series. So he's a good one to study, particularly with modality. 80 to 87, he wrote Christina's World, which was one of the longest works he's ever written, 64 minutes, for flute, clarinet, piano, percussion, violin and cello. Needless to say, I think it's only been performed once. He did Edna Long for solo piano, and then the Flower Songs for 16 voices and 2 percussionists. In 88 to 93, he started doing some ABC orchestral commissions. So Yoga, the aria and transcendental dance for horns and strings, and the Symphony da Pace Domine, which again was a very large work, 30 minutes, translated to Give Peace Lord, which was interesting. Other works included his 3 children pieces, his 3 piano duets, his ecstatic dances, the Prelude and Dragonfly Dance, which a lot of people have studied, Marimba Dance, Pond-Light Mantras, Dance Mantra, Black Mountain Duos, Veni Creator Spiritus, and then of course the Dawn Mantras in 99, Southern Cross Chants and Mass of the Dreaming. White Ghost Dancing, very, very popular. It was written in 1999 originally, with a revision being done in 2007. Spirit Ground, another great work full of lots of ostinati, 2010, various symphony string quartets, and then the Water Spirit Song. Now, if you're a soloist and you want to look at the Water Spirit Song, it's been written for a number of different instruments, so it's one to have a bit of a look at. He is quite a prolific contributor to the arts, and of course for further research you can have a look at rossedwards.com and check out all his work. The AustralianMusicCentre.com.au also has a fantastic range of materials about Ross Edwards, and if you're interested in playing any of his works for any of your performances and things, then my advice would be to go and have a look at the Australian Music Centre breakdown of his scores and time frames and things of that nature. So that's just a little bit of history about Ross Edwards. You can see that he's big with, as his process evolved, he's gone from being quite atonal and quite eclectic from the 60s, a lot of Eastern influence, drones, travelling through sounds of nature, very sporadic. His motivic cellular development is one of his primary compositional devices. So he's worth having a bit of a look at here, Ross Edwards, Australian composer.